So thank you again, Philip, for this kind introduction. And before I start to talk about what I've been finding and thinking about Ezra, I just want to say that I'm delighted that so many of you are here. And I think one of the reasons you are here is probably because you all have particular respect and expectations of finding out a great deal about Ezra. And that's wonderful to know. But I just want to tell you that as a scholar, I also come to Ezra, and not necessarily with expectations, but we've been told in the most recent generations of scholars and thinkers that all of us, none of us are neutral, looking for absolute truth. We all come with baggage, whether we know it or not. So I hope that you will engage with both my baggage, which I will introduce you to at the beginning of this presentation, and with what I'm thinking, even if it's perhaps not exactly what is matching with what you're hoping to hear. I hope it will still inform you about some things from the past that you weren't aware of. Right. So to tell you how I got to Ezra, I want to start with my PhD that I did at King's College London. Here is the Strand campus entrance as it used to be, I think, where I did a PhD on the laws of the Damascus document, especially in 10 manuscripts of the text of that document from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that text was edited by a Jewish professor called Professor Joseph Baumgarten, who was a professor at Baltimore Hebrew College, which is now called Baltimore Hebrew University, as well as a rabbi. So I came from a legal text that was new to us and started to study Jewish law. And here is a picture of Cave 4, both from the outside and the inside, where those manuscripts that I was working on at King's College were found. And the story doesn't end quite there, or in fact, it started before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and Tessa has already mentioned the Geniza. So we also have manuscripts, later manuscripts, early medieval manuscripts of the same document from the Cairo Geniza. And those manuscripts, 2 of them are in Cambridge in the University Library, but I'm keen throughout the talk to pick out a Manchester connection. So I must also show you a picture of the wonderful John Rylands Library that also has some Geniza material, as well as a picture of one of the 2 amazing Scottish twin sisters who in the Victorian era traveled into the Middle East and actually alerted the professor of rabbinics in Cambridge of a number of Hebrew manuscripts that ended up in Cambridge. That's a marvelous story if you don't know about it. And here you see, get a little bit of a snapshot of sorting out the riches in Jerusalem on the left in the so-called scrollery that is in the basement of the Rockefeller Museum in the 1950s. All the scholars, the women amongst you will realize they were all at that point men. And I think, George can correct me, it's possible that on the right, I don't know, is that Allegro or not? It's quite difficult to see, but there was a Manchester connection also in those early days in the team. And on the right is Professor Solomon Schechter, rabbinic scholar from Cambridge, working on what he had from the Cairo Geniza. And I somehow find that picture always mildly reassuring about my own life, because I admire how calmly he sits in this rather messy environment. So here's a quick summary of a little bit of what I've been up to. And my latest book has literally just arrived. I've got a box just behind me, the Community Rules from Qumran at the bottom here. And again, as it's already been mentioned, there is a Manchester connection with my scholarship. The 2 items that I've circled are connected with George Brooke, who I'm delighted is also here, the companion that Philip has just mentioned, and another book that I co-edited with Ariel Feldman and Maria Chiota, and that is called Is There a Text in This Cave? Studies in the Textuality of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in honor of George Brooke. So that was the background, and as Philip also mentioned, most recently I've been working on the Ezra's legacy and the Dead Sea Scrolls, law and narratives of exclusion. And that is my funded project that I'm going to talk about here today. And as it happens, we've already welcomed Professor Liz Fried, and it's lovely to see Liz here. She was one of the delegates at my conference, and I had no idea, but her husband is an amazing photographer. So he took this rather special photo of everybody who was there. And again, there's a Manchester connection there in the back row. And there's also Sandra Jacobs, who did her PhD in Manchester, I believe. I hope I'm right in saying that. And that was a nice reminder. And here is also a link, and I'm very happy to share my slides with anybody who would be interested. I've put in a link here to a discussion about Ezra with 3 world-leading scholars on the topic. That's Professor Lawrence Schiffman, pictured here, from New York University. He spoke on what do the rabbis say about Ezra, and this was for a public audience, a public panel in the council house in the middle of Birmingham. And the second speaker is Professor Hugh Williamson from the University of Oxford. He talks about, was Ezra the father of Judaism, in this video? And finally, Professor Hindi Naiman, and I'm delighted that Hindi is here as well, of the University of Oxford, speaking about Ezra the prophet in 4th Ezra. So I'd advise you, if you don't like what you hear of me today, go back to this video and listen to a few other voices as well. And even if you do like anything of what I'm doing, I would highly recommend this video. So why did I look to the scrolls? And again, Philip's indicated the legal aspect, but I made a little tick list here. So clearly Ezra the scribe, and there's plenty of scribes in the Dead Sea Scrolls because we've got their handiwork for us to look at. Priests, a number of the texts from the scrolls are very priestly, interested in the cult and the minutiae of it. And Ezra is identified as a priest, legal scholars and Jewish law, as well as perhaps something we might call with Morton Smith, the pious life. And hearing of Morton Smith kind of reminds me of, I think they went to the same school, but I also want to shout out to Professor Albert Baumgarten, who is in the audience and somebody that the society may be interested in knowing. He is a very good friend of mine and a very eminent scholar who knows about a great many things, starting out on the Pharisees and also on the Dead Sea Scrolls and all kinds of things. So it's lovely not to see you, but to know that you're here, Al. Here we've got a picture that probably perhaps is Ezra holding the law from the synagogue at Europos, which is a site located on the banks of the Euphrates in Syria that has been called the Pompeii of the desert. And it gives us an idea that at this period in time, that we have an image that may depict that aspect of the figure of Ezra. Ezra in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or what Christians call the Old Testament, figures in chapters 7 to 10 of Ezra and chapters 8 and 12 of Nehemiah. We are told in Ezra 7 that he was commissioned by the Persian king Artaxerxes to lead the returnees back, another group of returnees. He is said to have brought the law to read it to the people, and we get told that the people learn very fast, and he also deals with a marriage crisis. That's not a crisis in a particular individual marriage, but it's a crisis about who had married whom and whether that was right or not. Ezra the scribe, as I mentioned, we learn from Ezra 7:6 that he's described as a skilled scribe. And Ezra 7:10 reads, Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to act upon it and to teach in Israel statute and commandment. Ezra the Reformer. So, as I indicated earlier, upon arrival, local leaders complained to Ezra that the people were not separating from the peoples of the lands. Scholars have offered a range of interpretations. Most likely, in my view, is the interpretation that this dispute about marrying peoples of the land and that the wives and the children should be really isolated and sent away is something reflecting a crisis of identity of who belongs in the land. And I won't dwell on that now, but I will move on to Ezra the priest and just remind you that his lineage is traced back to Aaron in Ezra 7. And according to Ezra 8:35, the returnees offer sacrifices. However, it's interesting that Ezra isn't mentioned as leading when that happens. And curiously, in my view, in Nehemiah 13, Nehemiah steps up, the governor. One of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. They have defiled the priesthood. Thus I, and that I is Nehemiah, I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. So that's very interesting that we have Nehemiah step up here, and we will see more about Nehemiah in a number of other sources. So my question that I'm posing now, and I will answer a little bit further on, how confident would someone like Ezra have been to officiate as a priest in the cult, given there was no temple in exile where he was located? It is unlikely that he ever set foot in the first temple. From the destruction and deportation under the Babylonians in 586 to the mission of Ezra, which scholars debate precisely when it took place, but it is certainly, anything up to a century or more, or just under a century. So it's quite likely that he was never in that first temple, never witnessed the animal sacrifice and that cult. So the question then is, how confident would he have been to step into the temple as he returned? We'll come back to that question. So I'm kind of asking, it's strange that he's not mentioned as leading the sacrifices in chapter 8:35. And I've been reflecting on what it would have been like to come into that context when you are not used to it and have never even seen it. Then we have another source called 1 Esdras, and that you may call the Greek Ezra. It's composed in Greek in the late third century, 4th to 3rd century, probably in Egypt. And this text doesn't have Nehemiah in it, so it's very much an Ezra text. We have a little later on, not a little, quite a lot later on, after the destruction of the first temple, we've got a composition known as 4th Ezra, where Ezra is described as an apocalyptic visionary. And this text was transmitted by Christians, but probably had some Jewish material within it. And Hindi Naiman, Professor Hindi Naiman, who is here in the audience, is a leading world expert on this text. So I won't say too much other than to tell you that written after the year 70 Common Era, it was probably written in Hebrew and translated into Greek. Both of these versions are lost, and we have to rely on translations. Ezra experiences visions of the end time and is guided by an angel Uriel. And we are also told that he is given a magic potion that allows him to dictate 24 books of the law alongside 7 esoteric books for the wise amongst the people to a group of scribes. So here we have a story that associates Ezra not only with studying and teaching the law, but actually dictating it and restoring it after it being destroyed in the destruction. And the image, I forgot to go to this slide for you. The image you've got here comes from a Latin manuscript, Codex Amiatinus, which you can see here in a nice YouTube clip about an exhibition of that codex in the British Library. That is also usually thought of to be Ezra. Now, Ezra also features in a number of Christian traditions. I'd already mentioned that fourth Ezra was handed on by Christians and is part of the Armenian, Ethiopic, and Eastern Orthodox churches' scriptures. Ezra is a saint in a number of Christian traditions. His saint's day is on the 13th of July. He's not in the genealogies of the New Testament. The only figure that we find there is the governor Zerubbabel, who was part of the first wave, an official appointed by the Persian government and associated with the building of the temple. So, taking stock here, we just go back one slide. Taking stock here is an important sort of way station for my talk, and I want to give you a summary by Lester Graby from the University of Hull on the figure of Ezra. And I quote Lester: "The figure of Ezra has been profoundly associated with the origin or promulgation or interpretation of Torah. The consequence is that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are in many ways the foundation of much scholarship, not only about the development of the Jewish religion, but even of how the Old Testament literature emerged." So Ezra is really a pillar of Jewish history and also important in the Christian tradition. So what else can we find that perhaps doesn't quite back this up? And I think Philip alluded to this a little bit. The evidence points from antiquity in two directions. So I have a number of slides entitled Ezra Ignored. And the first place where this happens is Jesus Ben Sira, the book of Ben Sira. Ben Sira was a learned scribe and the first to integrate the idea of, or often thought to be the first person to integrate the idea of Torah into his wisdom teaching, as well as he also had a strong sense of history. So one would have expected that somebody with an interest in Torah and history would have mentioned Ezra, particularly since he has a very well-known section in his work called In Praise of the Fathers. And in that Praise of the Fathers, we have a long list of great men. And as you will see on my next slide, Ezra does not get a look in there. We hear about 12 prophets, and then he's talking about how shall we magnify Zerubbabel. He was like a signet ring on the right hand, and so was Jeshua, the son of Josadak, and in their days they built the house of the Lord and raised a temple holy to the Lord, destined for everlasting glory. And then we move in line 13 to the memory of Nehemiah, also is lasting. He raised our fallen walls and set up gates and bars and rebuilt our ruined houses. And from there it moves to Enoch. So that is very interesting that in this book of Ben Sira, which is part of the Catholic canon, but not the Jewish scriptures, and this seems to be a Jewish learned thinker. We have reference to Zerubbabel, we have reference to Nehemiah. He is very much interested in the law, Ben Sira, and yet Ezra is not there. Then we have another source written in Greek where Ezra is ignored, and that is 2 Maccabees. It was written, a work in Greek in the late 2nd century before the Common Era, perhaps in Egypt. and again is part of the Catholic and Orthodox canon. And here we learn of Nehemiah again, who built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices when our ancestors were being led captive to Persia. The pious priests of that time took some of the fire of the altar and hid it in the hollow of a dry cistern. After many years, when it pleased God, Nehemiah sent descendants of the priests who had hidden the fire to get it. When they reported that they had not found fire, but only a thick liquid, he ordered them to dip it out and bring it. When the materials for the sacrifices were presented, Nehemiah ordered the priests to sprinkle the liquid on the wood and on the things laid upon it. The sun, which had been clouded over, shone out, and a great fire blazed up.
The Zoom virtual background is available for your meetings, webinars.
So here we have another source from the 2nd century BCE that again mentions Nehemiah, and some of what it says is similar to what we learn in the biblical book about his work in building the temple, but it also expands the tradition about rather miraculous story of the fire being taken away and then reinvigorated, a little bit like Ezra, like Elijah on Mount Horeb. And then Ezra barely there or not there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We only have three small pieces of a manuscript of Ezra, but all of the chapters that are preserved there, the preserved pieces, come from those chapters of the book of Ezra, from chapter 4, in fact, before Ezra is mentioned. Remember, he's introduced in chapter 7. So we don't know how large originally that scroll would have been. And of Nehemiah, we don't currently have any parts. There was discussion of a piece of Nehemiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that has recently been identified as one of the 21st century forgeries. Given that Ezra and Nehemiah in antiquity was one book, it is possible that the scroll did include Nehemiah, the scroll that we've now got some pieces of, but we just don't know on the basis of the pieces exactly how that scroll looked. There is one very interesting reference to the period of the restoration, the rebuilding of the temple in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in one of the texts, and that's very unusual because there are other texts that speak about the destruction under Babylon and then skip over the restoration, the new temple, skip everything until they come to the emergence of the sect in the second century BCE. That's very interesting because they seem to deliberately skip the forgiveness of God and the renewal that happened under Ezra and Nehemiah and go to themselves. But in this text, we read that there was an exception in a circle and a cycle of evil and wickedness. There was an exception amongst those, I put that in bold, who will come up from the land of their captivity to build the temple. And I shall speak to them, that's God talking, and I shall send them commandments, and they will understand, and everything which they and their fathers had abandoned, they will understand. Now, the translation here is those who will come up first from the land. And we have a participle in Hebrew here, ha'olim, and a participle can be translated past or future. A participle doesn't tell us what time frame it is referring to. And here it is a little bit ambiguous. It could refer to those who came up first from the captivity or those who will come up. And it's not quite clear who is meant by that, because we know that there are several generations, the first to come back who built the temple, and then Ezra and Nehemiah who reform and fix the walls. But it's very interesting to have this passage here, a reference to the Reformation and the restoration, rather, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The rabbis on Ezra, Ezra in the rabbinic literature has a very large profile. He's presented like a second Moses. He's able to pronounce the divine name. He established the forgotten Torah. He's identified sometimes with the prophet Malachi, whose name means my messenger. He's sometimes identified as a student of Jeremiah's scribe Baruch. And as a high priest upon the return, only he could prepare the ashes of the red heifer. And also the rabbis are concerned to explain why he came a bit later. And a number of reasons are given: that he wouldn't leave his aged teacher Baruch, that he was busy writing genealogy up to his time, or that Ezra was persecuted by the Judean exiles who did not believe his call for return was truthful. And you can find out a lot about these traditions and the reception of Ezra in the work of Liz Fried, who is also here. I think I've got a picture of some of her books coming up later. And later on, based perhaps on the fact that in 4th Ezra, we have the account of, after this portion being administered to Ezra, him dictating the law and a number of other books, the Bible, the Tanakh, as well as esoteric books. We do come across anti-Ezra polemics in the church fathers from the Christian side, amongst Muslim scholars, and also medieval Samaritan scholars. And the Muslim tradition would say Ezra falsified the text and missed out predictions of the prophets Jesus, Muhammad, and the Samaritans would say that their holy mountain, Mount Gerizim, near the western bank city of Nablus, should have been mentioned in the scriptures and isn't there. So we have clearly somewhere something you could call an Ezra fan club, and we can definitely be confident for antiquity that there was a group of people, however small, but certainly influential in their context, who portrayed or constructed Ezra for us in the way they did, and they identified with the values and activities attributed to him. And those values are legal piety, study of the law, and priestly concerns that we've seen. That much we know. Now I'm going to tell you a little preview of my findings, and I just, for fun, I said fasten your seatbelt. You may not like it, and we can talk about it afterwards. So firstly, yeah, here are two of Liz's books, and I think another one has just been published on Nehemiah, I believe, another commentary. Ezra, was he really a priest? I've hinted at this. So according to Ezra 9, we have community leaders bemoaning the illegitimate marriages, and Ezra's reaction to this problem is to conduct mourning rites, not as in morning, good morning, but as in after someone has passed away. Sadly, something we've had far too much of in recent months. Mourning rites and prayer. The priestly service at the evening sacrifice is mentioned in passing, but almost as a temporal marker until the evening sacrifice. Ezra 8:35, we notice the reference to sacrifices being offered, but not that Ezra is leading there. Now, Professor Williamson, who's written an excellent commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah as well, he has argued in that commentary, I quote, "It is reasonable to suppose that Ezra and his associates would have offered sacrifices both as a means of thanksgiving and for the repayment of vows undertaken before the journey. After all, they had not had the opportunity to sacrifice previously while in Babylon." In my view, I have already mentioned that I thought, actually, if you've never seen blood sacrifice taking place, you're coming back into the land. There is a temple. We're told in Ezra 10, Ezra is by the house of God, and there are priests sacrificing who know what they're doing. They may not be pleased to welcome other priests in because it's an economic issue as well, with priestly dues and parts of the sacrifice coming to the priests. And the more priests coming in, the more you have to share this revenue. So I'm struck that what he does do, according to Ezra 9, is conduct morning rites and prayer. And those are things that you can do when you're not at the temple, when you're away from the temple. And given the destruction and the horrors that were suffered by the exiles, it probably was something that kept them together, that you would mourn the loss of the temple and you would pray. And in fact, we have literature along those lines. Ezra's piety and community leadership. We learn that Ezra's personal piety is to the fore, unless what we're witnessing with the emphasis on confession, on weeping and fasting. And my question is this emphasis on confession, weeping and fasting a taste of communal worship away from the temple in exile? Because all of these things one could have conducted there, and it's likely that Ezra had expertise and leadership and authority and confidence in conducting those kinds of activities. So going back to our earlier discussion that Ezra never served in the temple or would have witnessed animal sacrifice, it is likely that it was not something, in my view, he would have been comfortable doing in front of potentially unsympathetic local priests who did have that expertise. So having a look at the land, the massive question in scholarship is, who are the people of the land? Are there people, Jewish people, who never left for the exile? And we know very, very little about them because the Tanakh that we have is very much written from the perspective of those who'd left and returned. But there is a little inkling of their voice in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 11, 15, and we don't hear them in a positive way. They are quoted as mocking, and I'll just read out what they say. So here we have, mortal, your kinsfolk, your own king, that's God speaking to Ezekiel, your fellow exiles, the whole house of Israel, all of them are those of whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem have said, they have gone far from the Lord. To us, this land is given for a possession. So it's in this passage here in Ezekiel that we hear a little bit of the sort of thing that's attributed to the people who never left. They are saying, this is ours. This land was given to us, and you have gone far away. So you get a bit of a sense of the tensions there that might have been going on. And my first passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls is rather interesting. It comes from the Damascus document, and I never noticed this aspect of it when I studied this legal material before. It's a passage about the offering from the vineyard and fruit trees according to their rule, and it refers to the land of holiness and the land of sojourn, and afterwards they may sell. So there's a 4th year produce rule about fruit trees that they are not to be consumed in the first years of the tree's life and bearing fruit. But this notion that there is a sense of a diaspora and land of holiness, which is likely the homeland, already there in the scrolls. More importantly, we have a big passage on disqualifications of priests. And one of the types of priests to be disqualified is one of the sons of Aaron who is taken captive by the nations. And then we have a gap in the text, and then it talks about to defile it with their uncleanness. He shall not approach the holy service within the curtain. He shall not eat from the sacred food. One of the sons of Aaron who departs to serve the nations is also disqualified. So the first person, to my knowledge, this first scholar who has noted the implications of this material to disqualify priests who have been captive amongst the nations is my good friend and colleague Professor Maxime Grossman at the University of Maryland at College Park. So this is another indication that the perspective of this particular law in the Damascus document from the Dead Sea Scrolls is really an aspect written from the land. Legal scholars in the land would be saying that, and actually it implicates Ezra. That was Max Grossman's insight some time ago. And then again in the Damascus document, and again I didn't notice the potential significance of this, we do have a passage about defilement of metals through Gentiles. And we read there, from all the gold, silver, copper, tin, and the lead with which the Gentiles have made idols, no one shall bring any of it to his pure stuff unless it is from new metal coming straight from the furnace. So any metal was suspect because you don't know what may have been done with it by the Gentiles in terms of idolatry. And therefore you could only be safe to have new metal straight from the furnace. And I am putting that next to Ezra 5, which is before Ezra comes onto the scene in the book, but there we hear that the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out from the temple that was in Jerusalem and brought into the temple of Babylon, Cyrus said to Sheshbazzar, one of the pioneers, according to the book of Ezra, take these vessels and put them in the temple. And again, I'm wondering here, there doesn't seem to be any recognition, or it's not acknowledged that that would be a problem, that you take metals that are cult objects from Jerusalem and they're stored in a foreign god's temple, because that temple would have been a god of Marduk temple, the Babylonian god, is handed over. That was the victors who had taken the vessels, handed over back and then returned. So it does show that whoever wrote this as a glorious story is not aware of concerns about potentially defilement with metals. So coming to my conclusion, all I'm hoping here is to open some fresh perspectives and to think about the silences on Ezra in some of our earliest sources are worth reflecting on what they might mean. Ezra also has multiple titles, as we saw, priest, scribe, Torah scholar, but in terms of his actions, he barely does anything cultic. And perhaps on reflection, my argument is perhaps that is not surprising. What does come to the fore is his piety, his immersion in the scriptures, his leading morning rites, and all of these kind of actions, to my mind, sit very easily with a setting in exile. And that would have kept the community together, which is something that happened. That there seemed to have been a cohesive living together and survival of the community. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, have something to add to the very scarce voices of the people of the land who have their own claim to holiness. They say, this is our land. And I don't think that connection has been made with the very scant voices in the Hebrew Bible, that some of the material in the Dead Sea Scrolls may reflect some of the voices and concerns of those peoples of the land. And this is where I will stop. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I find that absolutely fascinating. Now we've got time for some questions. I have had a few sent to me. One is from Othman, who wants to know, is one Esdras not, oh no, sorry, was Ezra the only one who could read and write? Am I right, Othman? This is the point that you're raising. So it's a question about the literacy, the condition of literacy when Ezra comes around.
We know that change of languages. When they were in Babylon, they weren't allowed to speak any of their language. So they've forgotten their language. And when they come home, they found the people that left to tell the land also have different language. But I remember hearing that Cyrus asked Ezra to collect the history before they go back and write it down. So my thought is that Ezra was actually one of Cyrus' what I call him, religious leaders, that he can go and ask him so he can learn more and more about the Hebrew nation.
Yes, thank you very much. That's you cover quite a lot of ground there, Osman. I mean, the question of literacy is interesting, and there's a lot of work on this because, for one thing, people will say, what do you define literacy as? We know some people were able to sign a document or even to indicate something approximating a signature. Other people, most people, probably couldn't read and write at all, but yet we have then others in as we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also as we see in the production of the Hebrew Bible, whether that is starting to take shape in the land, and also after the exile, studying the scriptures was clearly very important, and some of this study may well have come back and contributed to our Bible. Some of these people were very highly educated, very literate. And the question of languages is also extremely interesting because we do have several languages in the land at this time. We have inscriptions in several languages and people who are fluent. Some of the highest educated people clearly could operate in several languages. The book of Daniel uses Hebrew and Aramaic. The Dead Sea Scrolls attest Hebrew, Aramaic, and a little bit of Greek. I don't think there was, I think Hebrew did continue in, Professor Alexander can correct me, but Hebrew was very much to the fore in Babylon as well, where there was quite a lot of independence. We have some sources of some of the exiles now, and we know there was an exilarch, and we know all the way through with the Babylonian Talmud, many hundreds of years later, there was Jewish learning in that part of the world. It is very, very important. So some very important questions you're asking there, and the relationship as well of Ezra to the Persian administration. I will defer here to Professor Fried, who is a world expert on that particular angle and has written a lot on it. And she actually reads Ezra. I'd recommend her work to you as very much part of the Persian imperial way of operating. So thank you very much for that question. Sorry for the long answer, but you just raised quite a lot of very prominent things that are being discussed. So yeah. Thank you very much, Otman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Lisbeth, you had a comment in the chat here about one Esdras. Do you want to develop that at all?
I just wanted to say that one Esdras was not found at the Dead Sea either.
No.
I mean, the passages that we know which differ between Ezra and one Esdras, those passages at least were not there. No. I have another question for you, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if the fact that Ezra is not mentioned in Ben Sira or at the Dead Sea implies that the text that we have was written, the text that we have about Ezra was written after Ben Sira and at the time of the Maccabees.
Interesting, yeah, very interesting. I mean, that would make it quite late, wouldn't it? That would make you more radical than me, I think, Liz, officially. It's possible. I'm curious that, yeah, I just think there isn't any polemic against Ezra in the sources that just big up Nehemiah. It just seems to be entirely innocent that they are not aware that they are leaving this gaping hole. So my sense is, perhaps not quite that late, but there were sources and circles who thought very highly of Ezra quite early on. And there were others who heard about and talked about Nehemiah, but not everywhere were those two together. So you may be right, Liz, you may be right, but I'm not sure how many people would date it quite so late.
Jolly good. Hindi has got a question. I don't see Hindi, but it's in the chat. Hindi, can you?
Yeah, hi.
Oh, there she is.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Charlotte. I have, just if I can make a follow-up point, Philip, to what Elizabeth just said and what Charlotte said, and then maybe ask a question about the pretty dramatic conclusion that Charlotte just offered today. Thank you very much for the paper. So Charlotte hosted this wonderful 3-day long workshop last December, a year ago, December. And in that wonderful conference towards the end, I believe, Charlotte, you suggested, along with Reinhard Kratz and others, and Hugh Williamson, that possibly what we call Ezra and Nehemiah now is a later construct. It doesn't mean that all of the traditions are that late, but the assembled form in the way that it is. And we also put Esther in the mix, that perhaps the reason why we don't have these texts and there are elements that are consistent, as you pointed out so eloquently in your lecture, there are many points like the morning rites and the prayer that is very, very consistent with much of what we find in the scrolls. Obviously, we find lots of views that aren't all consistent with each other in the scrolls. So that's one way, I think, of addressing what Elizabeth is speaking about and what you were talking about. But my question for you is actually about your conclusion, which I never heard you say this before. I think I've heard parts of this new book in different contexts, but I really wanted to ask for the implications for your association of the Yachad with the Amei Haaretz. I mean, this was a very radical move on your part, but I find it very attractive. And I think you're suggesting, if I understood correctly, that that same tension that we find between the Jerusalem priesthood and the self-imposed exile or the exile of the community, you know, whether constructed or actual, as reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls, perhaps has something to do with the way in which they don't integrate the Ezra materials, or they distance themselves from the Zerah HaKodesh that's associated with the Ezrian strand, even though we get elements of the Nehemiah materials in, granted, very small amounts, but we get some recognition that there's some knowledge of Ezra and Nehemiah conceptually a lot and then textually a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I like the phrase you used, that we have Ezra and Nehemiah in our ancient sources, but more often separate. And in the book that we know, they are assembled. But when you look at the scholarship on Ezra and Nehemiah, there are so many arguments about which part is the Ezra memoir, which part is the Nehemiah memoir. When was Ezra's mission? When was Nehemiah's mission? So you can already see in the scholarship that they have a sense of two things were being put together. Sometimes they say, were they both there at the same time? Who came first? So I think there is a strong sense, and we can see it with the Greek one Ezra that doesn't mention Nehemiah, that there is, I think early on, you're right, they're not together. The peoples of the land's voices in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I haven't really fully developed that further, other than having a sense that I think we might have that. It's always been a bit of a debate whether the halakhic material that doesn't mention a particular sect, how old is it? Who is it? And I think it is very exciting to think that there's some continuity there with some of the people who stayed in the land all the time. And we know later, and I'm no expert on this, but we've got the two Talmuds. We've got a Palestinian Talmud as well as a Babylonian Talmud. So we know later there's a lot of movement between the two sides of Jewish life and learning, between the different academies and rabbinic circles. So I just feel quite excited to think that we've got a sense of some of those voices that otherwise were lost. And I'm still trying to fill in some of those gaps for myself in terms of the implications. So thank you very much, Hindi.
Thank you, Charlotte. A comment from Lalive Klenman. I don't see her on my screen. Lalive, do you want to come in on this and raise your question?
Thank you, Philip. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for a fascinating presentation. It's fortuitous you mentioned the Talmuds, because I'm taking us a little bit positively in a modern direction here. But I've always been curious at the fact that the early Palestinian rabbis, at least, do not seem to rely on Ezra or Nehemiah very much in their discourse on intermarriage, when it would seem that they have sort of a ready-made halachic source that they could have taken with them. And I wonder how you might interpret their silence in view of the antique silence that you identify.
Well, I'm fascinated. It sounds like we need to take this offline as well and have more of a conversation, because if you're working on that later material, I'm keen to think about that, because it would, what you said would fit quite well with what I've been finding. And that's very exciting. So I don't know what the rest of the audience might be thinking, goodness me, what's she done to the Ezra I came with? But I think to find some of the traditions from the land before people went into exile, and then some came back and some stayed, is very exciting. And I'd love to talk more about this, Lalive. Find out what you're doing.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, Peter Schick makes an interesting point. This is picking up Charlotte with the language question and so on. Is Peter Schick somewhere?
Yes, I'm still here. It's Cyrus made a proclamation, which I forget it's in the Old Testament, but when he allowed the people to go back to rebuild the temple after they'd been in the Babylonian exile, there is actually a thing called the Cyrus cylinder that this was engraved on, and it is in several languages. It's in the British Museum, you can see it there.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And quite often we get inscriptions in several languages. I think the Behistun inscription as well, isn't it? And you can't even reach it very easily because it's up on this cliff. There's a sense of perhaps also trying to express your own greatness, you know, in inscribing this in all of these different languages. It's interesting for us to think why they would have done it that way. So just to sort of make that much broader claim. But yes, that's very interesting.
Yeah. If I might just comment on that, Charlotte, it's a very interesting question about the languages that were used within the Persian administration. I mean, the normal sense is that they used Aramaic as the standard language of administration, and that seems to be beyond doubt. But I've just been reading with a group of students Esther in Hebrew, and it really struck me the comment that when the decree goes out, it stresses in Esther that it was written in the script and in the language of all the different peoples. And that really took me by surprise. And I don't know how true that might have been, that on occasions they would have, actually targeted certain important decrees by writing them in the script. It uses katav and in the language, the lashon of the peoples. And I just, another comment, I mean, Esther is a very interesting example of a very fine Hebrew text written in the Eastern diaspora. So there were clearly, whoever wrote Esther, I'm absolutely sure it was written in the Eastern diaspora. They had a very good command of Hebrew, even though it was almost certainly not their first language. So anyway, I'm just looking at the, Charles Bloom has a question. Is Charles somewhere? Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Charles Bloom from Manchester, one of Joe Dweck's boys. The book of 12 prophets might contain some relevant information. Two of the prophets in that book, Haggai and Nehemiah, made important pronouncements and had activity in relation to the restoration
Yes.
and the building of the temple. Haggai exhorted the people to build a temple, and when they began their lost heart, he exhorted them again. No reference at all to Ezra, but he does refer to Joshua the high priest, and he refers to Zerubbabel, who was the leader. And then we get to Zechariah, who has lots of mystical prophecies, but in two of his prophecies, he also exhorts the building of the temple, and he makes specific reference again to Joshua and Zerubbabel, the high priest and the prince. Not a word about Ezra. Now, I've never understood this. Is that relevant to what you're saying? Does it support you, or is there another explanation?
No, I think that is very relevant. Thank you very much, Charles. And those two books are very important to describe the period when the temple was first built. And also interesting, like you say, there was some resistance amongst the people. There wasn't that great enthusiasm we might have expected. And we have the same, in a sense, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, because in the early chapters of that book, before Ezra comes on the scene, we do have reference to Zerubbabel and to another intriguing prince called Sheshbazzar. So there is a sort of a first wave of people returning and rebuilding the temple. And then I think the activities of Ezra and Nehemiah follow on from that in order to go and bring the law and the vessels, and the vessels are there, but bring the law and the interpretation as a sort of a reform, a social reform of problems in the community, as well as Nehemiah's mission, which is to fix the fortifications and the walls. So I think the two are even connected, those separate phases in the return in Ezra and Nehemiah, but in the books of Haggai and Zechariah, you're quite right. Here we are only in that first phase, and they seem to describe something prior to the arrival of Ezra. So very relevant, and I didn't have time to go into that. So I'm very grateful to you, Charles, for drawing attention to that.
Right. Well, we seem to have run out of questions in chat. If there's no one else burning to ask a question, could I just, as chair, put in one comment, Charlotte, which partly to thank you for what I found as a very stimulating presentation. I'd never thought of it in this way, in the way that you've put it, about the puzzle of the absence of Ezra at Qumran. And the thought that struck me was that I think there's evidence that in Qumran, they never thought the exile had ended, or never fully ended. And this explains why they seem to have been composing laments for the destruction of the first temple. So you get texts which are based on the biblical book of Lamentations, on the biblical book of Eicha, clearly based on them, but they're developments of them, they're new compositions. And I've suggested this showed that they still mourned the destruction of the first temple. They still celebrated the 9th of Av after the temple had been rebuilt. And that seems to suggest a kind of rejection of the temple. If they were saying, you know, the exile has never fully ended. So, and in that context, you could see that they wouldn't have been particularly enamored of Ezra because he was one of the great architects of the the return from exile and the reconstitution of the Jewish people. So I mean, it's just a thought. I don't know whether it makes any
I
sense.
think it's very interesting, because you could set alongside of what you mentioned also the great interest eschatologically in the new temple, the new
Yes.
temple scroll describing this magnificent, huge temple and the temple city. So perhaps clearly they must have been aware of the second temple. They weren't happy with what was going on in it. As I say, we don't know how old some of the very technical halakhic things are about purity.
Yes.
Even if they acknowledged it, they thought something better was expected. And that might also, if they had already moved on to say, this isn't very good, we're looking to this new Jerusalem, this new temple that the temple scroll is describing, then yes, that would make sense.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating just to sort of reflect on other things in light of, going down the path that I went down, and it's curious. But again, I come to see the scrolls more and more as actually quite diverse in some aspects, like the one text that I quoted, 4Q390. That Apocryphon of Jeremiah, I think is the title. It refers to that generation of people who came back as great heroes. So not all of the scrolls may necessarily be of one voice, because that is quite different from the Damascus document, where if that generation had been great, they would have mentioned it, and they don't. So I think there's quite a lot of material there to get our teeth into still. We've had the material for a while, but we won't run out of things to think about, I think.
Yeah. Well, I see there's a few questions coming in, but I think we probably ought to draw stumps there and let you off the hook, Charlotte. And if I might express our collective appreciation for the paper you've given, and wish you every success in this research. I hope a book comes out of it, or
definitely, yeah.
A book is going to come out of that. And
yeah, there'll be a monograph, and there's some articles, one's already out, I think it's a Mythica, and there'll be a collection of the essays from the conference.
Right.
Liz and others. So hopefully over time there'll be a fair few things coming out from it.
Yeah, and I'm sure everyone will want to thank you in the approved fashion for a fascinating. And I don't know whether Tessa or Anthony want to say anything just about the next meeting. I will.
Tessa, would you like to just?
Yeah, I was muted. Sorry. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, everybody. First of all, who has participated. Charlotte, for a wonderful lecture, full of interesting things. Philip, for adding a lot by your chairmanship, and Anthony for the Zoom, ever more efficient, and all of you for being here. So yes, our next meeting, see you all on the date that I mentioned, and let me imprint it on your mind, 16th of December, 4 o'clock, Sardis Synagogue. Anthony Shepherd should be very good, and do get in touch with Sheila Ford, whose email address you have. She will register you and send you the Zoom. Was somebody trying to ask something, or is it just a hand waving?
I think it was a congratulatory hand.
Or somebody saying they can't wait until December the 16th. Well, I think with that, we bid you all goodbye. Thanks especially to our Manchester friends, to everybody on the other side of the world. Happy Thanksgiving, those in the States, and see you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.